So good morning again. We're going to talk about the accident reports as per usual. If you're completely unfamiliar, the ISA has been collecting data about Slackline accidents for several years now, and so far we've collected a couple hundred of individual reports. And from these reports, we do our recommendations, failed Fridays, annual summaries, and talks like this. I mean, you've probably seen it before. This year, instead of looking at everything that happened, I would like to focus on a single accident in a little more detail, and then also look at the rest of the accidents afterwards. But I have the feeling that we aren't paying quite enough attention to the things that maybe really matter. So let's start with an accident that happened earlier this summer. And if I'm going too quickly, that's because I've measured this presentation and it's way too long. So if there's something that you've missed, just maybe raise a hand, give me notice so I can repeat. But yes, the first accident I want to look at today happened in this quarry, as you can see. And what happened is that, in the wrong window, I don't like presentations. So yeah. So what happened is that someone came along with a hippie bus and noticed, oh, this is a nice quarry. How about I put a highline here? They did, and it was quite nice. And eventually they came back and used the spot over and over again until they had an agreement with the landowner that they could leave the line permanently. So now our rigger is gone, but the line is still there. And the line is not very far from a city or a community of highliners who go and come there at some time. Here's an example of our highliner who goes to the line, and in our specific case, on that day of the accident, he also brought two friends. And he has been to had been to the spot before. The other two weren't quite as familiar with either the spot and highlining itself. So they're fairly new to the equipment and everything, and they don't have all the experience necessary. But our friend, who's here, as Johan said, with the Swami belt here in orange, is fairly confident and has also been to that exact space and to that exact line before. Now, he ties in, he goes on the line, everything is nice, he walks across, and at the end of the line, fairly close to the anchor, he takes a leash fall. And when he takes a leash fall, he falls all the way to the ground. Right. Now the question is what happened? And to understand what happened, we have to look at a specific piece of equipment, and that is the vortex ring from Slackline. I don't know if everyone is familiar, but I'm just going to explain it real quickly. It's technically not a ring, but a thimble. So you use the rope of the leash to go around the line and the backup as well. And it's inside the ring to give the ring stability and strength. So the ring itself is not what keeps you safe. It's just a guidance for the rope to go around your highline. And I know it's not easy to see from the pictures, but it's actually made of plastic and it's black and white pieces. So you can maybe see that it's not super safe to look at, to rig as a normal ring. And the manual itself says, as you can see at the bottom, to never attempt to tie in to the vortex like a classic ring. Because as we've just seen, and our highliner unfortunately has experienced, the ring doesn't work when it's not used as a thimble. Now, we can look at a couple different things when we want to understand what exactly happened. And the first thing, and maybe the wrong thing to do, is to look at who's at fault, right? So every time there's an accident or someone posts something about an accident, the initial or your first initial reaction is usually to look at who made a mistake. Because in the end, all accidents are somehow a mistake or a series of smaller mistakes that eventually lead to a failure. And if we look at this specific accident, I mean, the victim of the accident is probably also the one who's mostly at fault, right? They incorrectly used the vortex. They didn't see that it was made of plastic. They didn't realize that it was 2 pieces, and they didn't tie the leash in correctly. Maybe I haven't said this, but when you go to that location, you have to bring the leash. The ring is already there, but you have to bring the leash and tie the leash to the rings. So this is how the accident could have happened in the first place. So the leash wasn't there. Every time you go, you bring the leash, so that no one goes on the line who's not also a highliner. Now, who else could possibly be at fault, or at least partly at fault? Well, of course, the 2 people who were also present are the most likely people to also be involved, right? They could have maybe seen the mistake as well. Maybe they didn't do a proper body check. And if they did, and also checked the rings of the leash, even an inexperienced person, you could argue, should have seen that they've been made out of plastic and maybe not to be trusted as a normal ring. Now, the next person that is sort of related to the accident is probably the person that rigged the line, right? Why would you put a vortex ring of all the rings on a line that is used by beginners, that is also used permanently, that is used often as a training line with probably many leash walls? So that's our next target, right? Afterwards, could you also maybe blame the community themselves, right? Everyone who went to the spot before the accident also brought the leash, and they also tied into the vortex ring, and none of them stopped to think if that was a good idea, or if they maybe should change their methods of operation. And of course, you could also ask, well, is that one small line of orange text enough to make sure that people don't misuse the vortex ring itself, right? Is the manufacturer at least partially maybe to blame for what happened? Because the product is kind of very, very different to everything else that exists on the market. And there's no real markings on the product itself that warn you against this kind of accident, nor is there anything to prevent you from clipping the ring or leaving the ring as is without a leash in it, right? And lastly, maybe it's also partly our fault, because we've had a couple of incidents with the vortex already, mostly abrasion related, and sometimes the knot coming out or crushing the ring in weird places. So maybe we could have been a bit more proactive about this piece of equipment and offered more warnings or more education about how to use it and when to use it specifically. Because I know for certain that at every rigger certification, we tell people, or someone asks us, hey, what about the vortex? I've seen it used a couple of times. What do you think about it? And then Sarah and I usually answer, well, it's a nice thing to have for like an alpine project or your own like secret mission. But for a festival environment, for what we certify our riggers to, it's not the best use case because it's so different from everything else. So maybe it's also our fault. Now, in the end, everyone is of course partly to blame. So if any one of the people involved made a different decision or paid a little bit more attention or was a little bit more experienced, then this accident could have been prevented, at least in this specific case, right? Because if we look at this, we don't really get all that much information if we just ask the question, who is to blame or who's at fault or who made the mistakes, right? This is not a very useful way of thinking when you want to prevent accidents. Of course, when you're a judge or a jury or an insurance company or an investigator, at some point you have to figure out who was responsible. But for us as a community and for us as a Slackline association and for every one of you as a highliner or slackliner or a rigger, the trying to find out who's to blame doesn't help you prevent accidents in the future. Because all you know, or all you will find out if you ask this question is, well, you should have paid more attention, right? So instead, let's look at a couple different angles of how you can approach this specific accident, or basically all accidents if you want to, and try to learn how accidents happen and what we may be able to do to prevent them in the future. I used the word angles before I had methods, and then I had perspectives. None of the words are good, but either way, here we go. So the first thing to do is to look at the chain of events. And for our specific accident, that is sort of what we did earlier, where I explained what happened. And when you look at the chain of events, you're doing it from the eye of an investigator, right? So you want to figure out all the causal relationships between everything that happened and how it leads to another thing, which leads to another thing, which leads to another thing. But when you do this, you have to be very careful not to work backwards in time. Because if you know the accident, or if you know what happened, it's always easy to assume that everything leads to the accident. Every decision made leads to the accident. So in our case, okay, why did you only take 2 inexperienced people and none of them could do a proper body check? This is something that with hindsight seems like a stupid idea to go basically alone because you're only bringing inexperienced people. But if you work from what is called the blunt end, so if you work from the past, like all the people who were involved in the accident, then you see all the possible options of decisions they could have made, and not all of them lead to accidents. So our chain of events approach or angle is good for an investigation and to understand the mechanics of specific failures. In our case, it's fairly simple because the accident is fairly simple. But if we look at, for example, the first lightning lines, or we still try to understand what happens to the lightning lines or the static discharge problem that we have, it's good to figure out all the different factors and then go forward and explore the tree of possibilities. And when you do that and write down, okay, all the decisions that have been made or could have been made, we go to the next angle. And that is sort of barriers or a Swiss cheese model. And in the Swiss cheese model, you think safety is basically the absence of danger, right? So everyone is safe as long as there's nothing dangerous that could happen. And what you do is you fix each of the dangerous possibilities, either with warnings, or you disallow it, or you train people on specific problems they've had. And you try to fix your system with all those patches. So you're basically plugging all the holes in the Swiss cheese to make your highline or your system in general as safe as possible. So in our case, this would be, okay, it's mandatory to have body checks. It's mandatory not to go alone. It's mandatory to have warnings on pieces of equipment that may be misused. Right? And all these single steps can help to reduce the chances of accidents. This, of course, only works if either you have a very good imagination and you can foresee all the accidents, or at least it works once the accident has happened once. Okay? So we can fix everything we know, and we can try to fix everything we imagine, but what we don't know, we can't fix. And this approach is of course great for manufacturers because it evades the legal problems if you already put all the possible failures in your manual. And it's also great for festival organizers because you really want to control where people can go, what people can do, what equipment do they have, that they can't change anything on your rigs. So there you try to minimize the danger by plugging all the holes. Our next angle is called drift. And drift is what happens when things develop over time. So normally, or usually, we try to start with a safe system. So at the end of the day, your highline is rigged, everyone has done all the double checks, everything is safe, right? And then You go and you do a couple leash falls, everything stretches a little bit. Maybe the padding isn't in the same place as it was before. People sort of start to cut corners, right? Everyone becomes more familiar and more at ease with being around the edge. You know, you jump over a piece of rock to get to an anchor that you probably previously would have used a rappel or a safety for. Because as you experience the place more and more, you grow more confident. And this is what safety engineers usually call drift. And it means that slowly, because for efficiency gains, to save some time, we drift into an unsafe state. And this is true for people as well as for equipment. So that means that when you buy something new, it's probably the most safe for the first couple uses. And then if you don't take care of your equipment, if you leave it out in the dirt, if it's exposed to sunlight, slowly the safety goes down. This is also true for a rigged highline, because at the beginning, everyone has done all the checks. And then as more and more people use it, you also sort of slowly drift away from that safe state that everyone agreed to at the very beginning. And this angle is very helpful for experienced highliners and teams. And in our specific case, that was also probably true when the highline was first rigged, because everyone who was there when they first rigged the highline agreed to having a vortex, right? No one thought of this as problematic because everyone was familiar with the product. And as people have become more at ease with the idea of having the permanent line there, and maybe also sending beginners more or less by themselves, you get an unsafe system, even though the system hasn't changed. And lastly, there's something called system theory, which is very complex, and I'm going to skip over most of it. The basic idea is that we shouldn't think of a system, in our case a highline, as a safe thing or a safe environment, and that people who make stupid decisions bring the danger to the system. Instead, it's more helpful for everyone to think that the highline itself is sort of unstable, and you need experienced people who make good decisions to keep the system safe. So nothing is inherently safe always, but it needs good decisions, good actions from experienced people to keep it in that safe space. Otherwise, it will fall eventually to either side. Now, instead of going to the who question and blaming people, we should assume that everyone is always acting with their own best interest in mind. And everyone is acting in a sensible way, at least to what they think is sensible at that specific time, right? So give everyone the benefit of doubt, so to speak, that they try to make the best decisions and that they don't go to places to make mistakes, right? No one goes on a highline to fall off the highline because they forgot to tie in. Everyone tries to be as safe as possible. And if you want to improve the safety of yourself, your team, or the highline community in general, you should pretend as if there were no human error. Okay? Of course, all accidents are ultimately caused by bad choices or bad actions from individuals, but it's not helpful to think about it that way. It's not helpful to see the human error as the ultimate reason to why the accident happened. Instead, all errors or all mistakes have an underlying factor or a multitude of factors that lead to that specific accident. So in the end, let's try not to ask who had the accident or who is to blame or who made the mistake. Let's try to ask what happened and why it happened instead. And then we'll see that mistakes aren't random. And the more mistakes we have, the more accidents that happen, the more obvious this becomes to us as well, because we see, okay, at some point, accidents repeat themselves. Best example is the tie-in problem, right? If people forget to tie in or tie in incorrectly. At the very beginning, there was only one accident, and with, of course, the gravest of outcomes, but it was only one. So it could have been like a random mistake that just happens once. But now that we see, and with the help of the survey as well, we see how serious the problem actually is and how prevalent. There's a systematic problem that doesn't relate to the people who have the accident. This is probably the most important thing I want to say today. The accident is not linked to the person. There's always reasons behind the specific person. Everyone can have accidents. It doesn't matter if you've been highlighting for 10, 20, 15 years, or just a couple of days. You can have an accident, even if you've known, like maybe some people in the SAIR, we have read all the accident reports, and we still make accidents that are in the accident reports, right? It's not as easy as knowing what shouldn't happen to prevent it. And if you look at accidents, or if you look at like iffy situations that you've experienced yourself or experience in the future, try to remember what it was like before the accident. Because afterwards, everything is always easy. Everything is always so clear once you know the outcome. And when you hear a story about someone doing something stupid, try to imagine what it was like for that person, standing up in the morning, getting breakfast, having their coffee, going through all the actions they did that day without knowing that the accident will happen. And then maybe you'll be able to understand a little bit better how they could have ended up in that situation. So next, once we've explored these four angles and see sort of what led to the accident and what are the factors, what are some things that we see in our accident reports that could help you? So first, I would like to look at the warning signs. So whenever you see any of these, you're on the way to an accident, or you're very likely on the way to an accident. So the first thing that's often happening is sort of a responsibility-authority mismatch. And to explain this a bit better, I want to explain an accident that happened to Thomas and I, and also to another person fairly recently. And that is, you go to a place and you have some less experienced people with you, and they do the tape job because that's an easy task. And they have something to do while you concentrate on the more complicated. And in our two accidents, the one that we had and the one that was reported recently, is that the mainline and the backup were sort of twisted at a connection. So the mainline was connected to the backup and the backup was connected to the mainline. So when you tensioned the line, you were basically walking on mainline and then a backup, and untensioned underneath was a backup and a mainline. And all the tension and all technically all the safety was held by just the tapes at the connection. So when those tapes would fail, you would basically take a backup fall without anything failing, of course, but you would fall a significant distance. And in the case of Thomas and I, we saw it when first sliding across because we felt that something was really odd. In the other case that was reported, they actually went highlining for a couple of tries. So people had leash falls, people walked out a couple steps, tried around a bit. And the tape held, everything was fine. And at one point, someone actually got to the connection. Before that, no one managed to walk quite as far and couldn't get the ring across. And when they tried to look at the connection, they saw that everything, like the tape was all bunched up and everything looked really strange. So they got off, re-rigged the line. And this kind of incident happened, or this kind of problem shows itself in many different ways. But basically what it means is that we give a task or a responsibility to someone but they don't have all the necessary tools to perform that task. So either they don't have the experience to understand the importance of getting the mainline and the backup right, in our case, in this specific accident, or they literally don't have the tools. So you task someone with checking all the anchors, and maybe they don't have a wrench, they don't have a checklist, they don't know where all the anchors and all the pathways are to access all the anchors. So every time you give a task to someone, make sure they understand all the upwards implications of completing or not completing that task correctly. Next warning sign, or the next problem that we often encounter, is called cognitive fixation. And it's very similar to planned continuation, which is the next one, but it's basically what happens when you sort of go beyond what you have planned beforehand. So let's say you go into a situation and then something happens that you didn't expect. For example, the accident that happened in France at the beginning of the year, where a GoPro fell down the cliff and someone had to do a GoPro rescue. And that was, of course, unplanned. No one expected to go down. And so the person who wanted to go rescue the Highline rappelled on 2 strands on their ATC down into the cliff, retrieved the GoPro, and when they tried to ascend with their gree-gree, they somehow forgot or didn't realize that if you only attach yourself to one of the 2 strands, you're just going to pull out the other end. And this is eventually what happened, and they fell down and gravely injured themselves. And this is something that, again, happens very often when you have to improvise. So imagine yourself, or imagine what it looks like when you have an action film, when someone has to unexpectedly land an airplane. This, or has some other crazy adventure. This is sort of cognitive fixation at its best. When you are faced with a problem and all you can do is focus on that problem, and everything sort of directs you to make decisions right now, and you just go deeper and deeper into that state of fixing stuff that is thrown at you. If you find yourself in a situation like this and you become really focused on a specific task or really overworked with all the decisions you have to make, you have to stop, because this is a surefire way to get yourself in a situation you don't want to be in. The other obvious one that's sort of mental challenge is fatigue. And I'll say something about numbers at the end, but fatigue is one of the biggest contributors to having accidents, especially when you look at injuries. So dismounts, leash faults, they always happen sort of at the end of a session, right? When you're tired, when you've rigged all day, when you've already done a couple of tries on that new trick you want to learn, and you think to yourself, okay, one more go, this is when you have the accident. Another thing that's important to understand is that bad choices don't necessitate bad outcomes, and vice versa. So not all accidents come by bad choice. For example, there was an accident in July where someone tried to tag a 600-meter line. I think it was 600 or 700. And they installed 2 kootenays as a Z-drag, which is a good decision to make. And what happened was that one of the webbings was so thin, the mainline was so thin that it got stuck inside between the side plates and the pulley of the kootenay. And they tried to get it out, and of course they got their hand stuck as well and had some finger injuries. But it means that even though you make a good plan and good decisions, that doesn't save you from the occasional accident. And it also means that even though you make stupid choices all the time and have bad rigging, it doesn't mean you're going to have an accident, which is also lucky for us, I guess. And the last thing I want to list as a warning sign is you have to understand that danger is not necessarily a pyramid. So only because there have been loads of accidents where someone got their finger stuck in the leash or their toe stuck in the leash, there's not ultimately going to be more serious accidents concerning leash faults. unless of course you haven't tied in. There's some accidents that happen, and their severity is always the same, right? So all the dismount accidents are always going to be twisted ankle, broken toes, I don't know, cut sole of your feet because there was glass on the ground. And it's more likely to have a really bad accident that is related to just daily frustrations that you have. So when you're tagging a line and stuff is like annoying and you just want to go to that branch where everything is stuck, and you go without safety, and then you have the bad accident. So you often feel aggravated. If you often feel aggravated or annoyed by something, that is where you have to be careful. So this is when you slide up with your hangover and it's really steep and you're sort of annoyed, oh, always I have to pull myself out of this super steep end of the high line. You should consider putting a rope and ascend the rope with like ascending gear, micro tracks, for example, because eventually you're going to be too tired and let go and either hurt yourself on your roller coaster ride, or you're going to let go and can't get yourself out again. So it's these things that happen often that aren't necessarily dangerous to you, but annoying, that are ultimately going to be an accident that you're going to have. Right. Last end of the presentation are countermeasures. So what can we do to prevent accidents in the future for us? So on a personal level, we're going to have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And what that means is you don't have to do everything by yourself and be the best at everyone for the reason of being the best. It means that everyone who's doing a task should be granted the possibility to do that task. So if you say you two guys are tagging the line or you two guys are rigging that anchor, don't interfere with them. Give them the chance to actually do it. Because if there's mixed or shared responsibility, it's much more likely that there'll be something that's forgotten and ultimately cause a problem. Mastery is fairly self-explanatory. Just be good at what you're doing and accept when other people are better at what needs to be done. So if you're an expert at the rope stuff, do the rope stuff. And if someone else is really good at hauling stuff up the mountain, they're going to haul stuff up the mountain. Tribal or communal is to have positive capacities. So people who are experts at certain topics need to be recognized as such. And you want to build a strong team where everyone has a purpose to what they're doing and also the ability to contribute. Because otherwise your community is not going to develop. This is something that we've seen a lot recently, that the experienced people always rig the lines. And then you have the newcomers who don't help because either it annoys the experienced person, they don't want to explain everything, or they don't have the time for other people to just be there and do their stuff. And, you know, in the end, you have to redo everything. Train your people. It's really helpful to have good people on your team. Trust me. That's basically everything you can do. And the last thing that's important in your community is to share stories, especially of things that did or almost went wrong. This is also something that's sort of in the spirit of the SAIR forms themselves. Storytelling is one of the most beneficial things that you can do in your community if you want everyone to be safer in the future. And as for the ISA as an institution, and maybe also for the manufacturers, it's important to standardize the equipment and practices. So that's sort of what we're trying to do with the ISA standards anyways. It's great to have trainings and workshops on specific skills. And also every now and then we should try to have de-drifting measures, which is sensitization to the fact that you can make mistakes, that you're human, and that things go wrong, and you always have to pay attention. The more experienced you are, the more likely you are to just think, okay, I can do everything, I'll do everything, I'll never make a mistake. Okay, one last thing, and then we can go to questions. So here are some of the numbers from the last year, but also it's sort of equivalent. For a couple of years now, we have basically the same distribution of accidents. And almost all of the injuries come from falling off a slackline eventually, right? Of course, there's some outliers, and most of the really grave injuries and also fatalities are sort of different mechanisms, but your everyday injury concerning slacklining comes from falling off. And right now it's about 50-50 between park and highlines. I don't mean to say that this is the reality of things, that's just what's reported. We think that there's probably a lot more like twisted ankles in parks than on highlines, of course, because there's just more park lines, but that's just our community that interacts with the SAIR forms. And 2/3 of those falling from a slackline incidents involve descriptors like tired, late, one last go. And that's something that really shocks me, because of course, in hindsight, you may think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have. But very often I see people, you know, going for that last try or at the end of the day, or trying that one new trick just one more time, and that's the time it goes wrong. So if you're thinking and feeling like, okay, I can maybe make one more go, then don't have that one more go, because that's the go that really ruins everyone's day. And then, of course, I think as Sarah said before, and what should be fairly obvious by now, is leashes are technically dangerous. So leashes are one of the big cause for accidents. So all the finger-related injuries that come from grabbing the leash, getting your finger stuck in the knot of the leash, often between the figure of 8 and the backup, or the tie-off, whatever you want to call it. So leash management is probably the most important skill for any highliner if you want to stay injury-free. In terms of failures, so this is equipment failures or something where something goes wrong with the actual highline or actual slackline. 1/3 are anchors, most of them abrasion related. So either a rope is cut through, or some of them, of course, are quick links, because everyone loves quick links and forgets to close them. Then 2/3 are wind related. I don't know if we have a wind specific talk this safety event, or if we already had one. If not, Philipp Queen is going to publish his findings, I hope, sometime soon. And if you had a wind-related problem, just go on our website and enter the data, please, so we can figure this out. Right. What I found quite surprising is that only 1/5 of the mistakes are seen before it's too late. Right. Of course, if you see that a quick link is open and you just close it, you're probably not going to file an accident report for this. But a lot of mistakes go by unseen and are only noticed when you de-rig the line or when it's really too late and someone had an accident. So if we think of this in sort of maybe absolute numbers and compare it to what Sarah had as answers on her survey, there's maybe 300 or 400 serious problems or serious mistakes on highlines every year, and only 1/5 of them are seen, most likely, maybe a bit more. So you're only an unlucky day away if you don't pay attention. First and last on the line is the worst car seat. So if you're the first on the line, you're most likely to have or to notice that there's something wrong. And if you're the last on the line, you're also the most likely to have an accident. This is, of course, somewhat reverse survivor's bias, because once you have an accident, you're also likely to be the last one on the line, hopefully, because everyone else is going to take care of you. But what we can see from this is it's good not to be a beginner, because then you're most likely to have a leash-related injury. And it's also good not to be a professional, because then you're most likely to have a serious injury. I think it's much like Richard said yesterday at the end of his talk. The more comfortable you are with the situation, the less likely you are to look, or the less likely you are to ignore the first warning signs, because you're so familiar and you've seen so many different situations and you've seen things go right very often, even though you maybe also have noticed the little warning signs already, but you just ignore them out of habit or out of arrogance. So if you're one of the people who say they're professional level highliners or professional level riggers, try to step back and see if that is really true, and make sure that you pay as much attention as if it was one of your first rigs. And then lastly, quick links are the least reliable connector. So a lot of people ask us about soft shackles, and yes, there has been a prominent or a fairly well-discussed accident this year with a soft shackle where it was installed in the mainline and opened because the noose didn't close correctly, because the soft shackle was padded with tubular webbing, which is, as far as we know, not necessary. And now, at least once, it was definitely a bad idea to have the padding in place. But at the moment, for sure, it's quick links you have to take care of the most. And we haven't had that many problems with any other connector. So always close them, always use a wrench to close them, and double and triple check your quick links. Okay, but that's it from me. I don't know what the time is and how much more time I'm allowed to talk, but if you have any questions about any accidents, let me know.
Thanks, Philipp. I think we have time for one or two questions. Anybody want to ask something?
I think if we look at the chat, Yoshi asked, what about responsibility of landowners? Yes, I think I just didn't find a good stock image of a landowner. But yes, of course, as a landowner, you're always going to be at least involved when there's an accident on your place. But I guess it's very country specific if you have actual responsibility. In most places, at least in Europe, you don't necessarily have to have responsibility, or you can get yourself out of responsibility with some fairly simple legal documents. Should both ends of the leash be part of body check? Yes, absolutely. There's been a couple really bad near misses with the knot on the ring side of the leash. So always check the entire leash when you do a body check. Yes, Eva, absolutely. Okay, and Josh said get certified quick links. Also true. There's been an accident last week with an uncertified quick link that just broke. It was closed correctly. It didn't open. It just literally broke in the mainline. So only use quick links that are EN certified, or if you live in America, the appropriate norm that the quick link should follow. And get all of your equipment from trusted sources. Don't buy anything at the hardware store. That goes onto your highlight. Yes, Johan.
Thanks, Philipp, for it was a really nice talk, really good one. Thanks. Like when you were talked about responsibility around the query with all the things, all the nice images. Mm-hmm. And I guess we already discussed this thing on Slack chat before, like eventually the gear will not solve the problem, in my opinion, at least. Like, we can keep on adding gear, adding warnings, adding papers, signs, whatever. I mean, it's a typical thing when you talk to the engineer. I mean, I'm a psychologist from education, from background. So I'm not an engineer as most highliners are, but or at least people are that I know. But anyway, if you talk to an engineer, they mostly think about changing the gear or changing the product instead of the human, because the humans are lazy and they don't want to change, or they think it's hard to change the opinion about something or to change the population. Well, psychologists mostly start from the human. They think no, then you might change them. So, or it's the same thing actually with the quick link. The just said with the broken quick link. It comes back again to, like, even if there was a rating on the broken quick link, if the ratings, how to say it, if the person thought something wrong about the rating, if he didn't understand what it meant, then it doesn't mean anything to put a rating on it. Even if it was a good one or whatever, you can buy. I mean, I wouldn't say something to buy from the hardware store, but there are things in the hardware store which have a rating. But if you don't understand what it means, or if you misinterpret it, then you can put as many warnings as you want, and it will never solve the problem of misusing it.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
So
I don't mean that if you buy all the nice equipment from all the nice places, you're necessarily safe.
Yeah,
if you can avoid using sketchy stuff, it already helps.
True. But the final thing is more like, and you talked about it with there was something in your presentation, like there was, I don't remember exactly what it was, like the system itself is safe, but when there's a human involved, there's a danger part, or there's a danger of adding something to the system which can fail. Or also the opposite, you said something. Can you go back to it?
Yeah, sure. So
the opposite was also something.
So the way you explained it just now is sort of the bad thinking, or the old school thinking, or maybe the engineer's approach. Everything is safe, and when the people clock in at work in the morning, that's where the danger comes. Right? Yeah. Just let the computer handle everything. But this is not appropriate. This is not helpful thinking. Maybe
it's partly true.
It doesn't work. It doesn't help. It doesn't make the world safer.
Yeah.
It's best to try to make the people as sensitive to the dangers, or as sensitive to the problems, and as knowledgeable and as capable as possible. And that will help your system. Even if they don't have to do anything, right? As long as they know and have the capacities to take care and pay attention. That's what helps you.
True. Yeah, you're right. Totally right. It's more like it's a side step maybe, but like the Chernobyl accident.
Yeah.
And a lot of these really, really bad accidents, they happen mostly like at early mornings or at night when somebody's experienced but was super tired, and there was like a series of events. Of course, it's never like one thing, but it's like a series of events that eventually lead to the incident. So I guess it's a mix of both the bad thinking, as you say, and the good thinking. It's I mean, even if you're good thinking, and if you have the right person at the right spot, if that person is emotionally unstable, or like super fatigued, or had whatever on his mind.
Yes, of course.
It's you're gonna mess up.
Yeah. In terms of fatigue, there's been some studies on construction workers, and 5 hours from when you stand up in the morning, from when you wake up, you're the safest, and you have 10 times the chance to have an accident 13 hours after you stand up. So if you haven't finished your project, 13 hours after you stood up in the morning, just do it the next day, because you're much more likely to have an accident after 13 hours, because people just don't function when they're tired.
Yeah, you're right. Okay. Yeah, thank you.